We are really happy to hear you about your ongoing research about not only slavery, but the memories of slavery in Saudi Arabia, which, as far as I know, as a historian of Saudi Arabia, is not only a touchy, sensitive subject, but is a crucial subject when it comes to understanding the society, the Saudi Arabian society, and its relation to history. And I do think that the topic of today is not only a challenging topic, as all of the topics we dealt before, but is in a way a novel and I think totally new subject for me, and I assume for many people attending your lecture today. Secondly, I would like to thank Mohammed, who might be the most brilliant scholar when it comes to slavery. No, I'm sure Mohammed will say no. But as the floor is mine, I use this privilege to thank him. Of course, the presence of Mohammed Waldi, who is now teaching at the Institut d'Études Politiques in Paris, Sciences Po, is kind of a token for us. More specifically, since he has just published A Slave Between Empire, and this might give the opportunity to bridge the studies of slavery and the memories of slavery in the Gulf and the Arabian Peninsula, and what Mohammed has just done and is still doing while researching about the history of slavery between empires, between the Europe, the Ottoman Empire, and the history of the Maghreb, both before and after colonization, the Maghreb out of colonization. So thank you very much, Mohammed and Faisal, to, kind of meeting today your field of research and trying to go over the boundaries of slaveries and the history of the Gulf and the Arabian Peninsula. So I remind you, we just have a 30-minute talk by Faisal. After a while, we will leave the floor to Mohammed Waldi. And then we'll switch to the question and answer. And I ask the people attending our lecture tonight to ask the question as soon as they have it, even from now on, in the chat window. We'll give them the opportunity to ask it both verbally, or we will read it once Mohammed has ended his comments. Thank you very much. And I'm really glad to welcome you in the name of the CEFREPA.
Thank you, Philippe. And I will just try to go into it and to fit this into 30 minutes. First and foremost, I'd like to thank Philippe, Mohammed, as well as Dima, Frédéric Lagrange from before, Makram today, the teams at CEFREPA and other institutions that have had a role in preparing and hosting this talk today. I really appreciate the opportunity. So I will start. 40 days before oil was discovered at Dammam Well number 7, a man named Mohammed bin Saad appeared at the British political agency in Bahrain. He had just arrived from Gulf, a city in Saudi Arabia only 40 kilometers from where oil would be discovered weeks later. Mohammed bin Saad was born a slave. His parents had been slaves of the man who claimed ownership over him before his escape. He described his master as a nomad who took Mohammed with him to the desert to look after camels in the winter, and in the summer brought him back to Gulf to shepherd his sheep. In the early 20th century, the British in the Gulf and Jeddah, as well as the French at Jeddah, had negotiated treaties with the Ottoman Empire to empower their consulates to free slaves who had escaped from the Arabian Peninsula, their consulates, and claimed to be European subjects by virtue of European colonial rule over their homeland. So if someone could claim to be from Nigeria and having been trafficked into slavery in Jeddah, they could go to the British consulate, they are British subjects, they can be returned home. In later negotiations, or at least interpretations of them, this evolved to include situations of ill treatment writ large. The British appear to have made the most use of this consular power, and thus there are thousands of manumissions granted by the British, either at the consulate in Jeddah or the political agencies in the Gulf, from the turn of the 20th century through the end of the Second World War. As such, these documents are very formulaic, even the so-called statements of enslaved people. Most of them read similar to Muhammad's. I was born here, followed by a series of sales and trajectories that often map more known trade routes, such as Hajj or trade, or they follow better known ecological movements like a drought or a famine, or political events like war and the Great Depression. Some describe what they were forced to do, others go straight to why they escaped, and they all end with a formulaic request for manumission from the British consulate. In other contexts, where paths of slavery have become the object of research by historians, such as North America and the Caribbean, or later, colonial Africa, methodological questions have rightly asked, is this the enslaved person's voice? Did they give this exact statement? The statements are clearly templates by British officials. However, while the literal statement may be almost generic, the trajectories therein are unique and they map a life. And that is where I would like to start us off today. As I've mentioned, the points, or if you want to say geolocation of these statements, match better known histories. In the case of Saudi Arabia in particular, we can see an emerging tension between slave owners and slaves who were lent by their owners to work for American oil companies in the Eastern Province, and they had their wages stolen or claimed by their owners. Many of these men decided to escape to Bahrain in order to receive their freedom and likely employment at British oil companies on the island. But these narratives of oil and exploration at the time tell a very different story from the more familiar, if you want to say, lowercase n nationalist narratives. A major factor underlying such narratives are the story of progress of modernity, either from the establishment of the country or the discovery of oil. I would like to suggest today that slavery and its abolition are as foundational to the establishment of modern Saudi Arabia as the infamous discovery of oil in 1938, but it's been largely ignored by the scholarship. So what exactly do I mean by that? What I mean is that both the discussion of slavery as well as enslaved people themselves are everywhere in the Arabian Peninsula of the early 20th century. And this, of course, predates the unification of the kingdom. The trafficking of people as slaves into and also out of the Arabian Peninsula predates not only the establishment of the Third Saudi state, but goes back hundreds of years. What I am suggesting, rather, is that familiar founding narratives and events popularly associated with the establishment of the modern kingdom are filled with discussions of slavery. I'm not suggesting that, rather, I am telling this. The sources themselves include stories of enslaved people, albeit almost always mediatized through others. Yet this presence is something discussed neither nationally nor in the historiography nor publicly. At most, it's something discussed within families or some communities within Saudi itself. For example, the recognition by the British of the independent kingdom of the Hejaz or Najd in 1926 and the Treaty of Jeddah in 1927. Well-known events. That this treaty was delayed due to differing positions on the understanding of slavery is not well known. The discovery of oil at the Dammam well number 7 in 1938, likewise, is foundational to our national narrative. That 2 years prior, in 1936, the newly renamed Kingdom of Saudi Arabia passed a code for the regulation of the slave trade within its borders is not. More importantly, this code ended the power of foreign consulates to manumit enslaved people who arrived to the consulate within the kingdom. From 1936 onward, the kingdom centralized control of the slave trade and manumission as part of its process towards abolishing slavery altogether. In fact, this code established a central national registry of enslaved people, or at least a directed one to be made. At a time when the subjectship or tab'iyya system was still relegated to Hijaz and other subjects registered under different recording systems, decades before national identification of the kingdom citizens was itself centralized, there existed a national central slave registry. The abolition of slavery in 1962 was part of a larger reform aimed at centralizing and rationalizing the emerging modern state structure. And yet these are not well known or widely discussed aspects of early Saudi history, nor are the social ramifications of the existence of slavery and its abolition, at least not at the academic level of study. In my presentation today, I'm aiming to outline several overarching narratives of written Saudi history, and then I'll discuss how I think those fit in. My goal is that in drawing these connections, we can all begin to see slavery, and that going forward, the scholarship on the region and its history can begin to better include these long silenced memories. In doing so, I'm not discovering or bringing necessarily a new, previously never known set of documents to light. Rather, I'm drawing on methods I have come to learn from critical geographers such as Catherine McKittrick to read and trace trajectories from historical sources to map these absent presences of people ignored in the current history, but present in the historical record. To challenge, in doing so, I think we can challenge our understanding of the past. For simplicity's sake, I've identified 5 overarching narratives, namely 1, nationalist historiographies of modernity, 2, kind of decolonial or pan-Arab historiographies of organized labor and opposition movements, 3, Orientalist historiographies, 4, narratives on the patriarchal history of society, focusing on gender, and 5, narratives approaching Saudi and peninsular history through apologist lenses of religion. Of course, these narratives are not mutually exclusive to one another. Questions of modernity preoccupy historians of the nation, as well as opposition movements. But what these narratives do for me, simply put, is group together both the major approaches to and topical concerns of writing Saudi history, and they all largely ignore the presence of enslaved people in the history of slavery. So let's start then with the nationalist narrative of unification. By nationalist narrative, what I mean here is just, like a teleological narrative of modernity, or like from the beginning of the unification of the country, at least until 1979, this idea that there was a solid progression from backwardness towards modernity. It started slowly and with Hijaz and Najd under separate administrations, and progressed more quickly with infrastructure and technocratic rule with the discovery of oil. This is the narrative that focuses on the transition of society from nomadic one to an urban one, society with now schools, followed by boys' schools and then girls' schools. And of course, this narrative largely follows the trajectories of late 20th century emerging national middle class, largely from simple backgrounds, increasingly educated, and whose family trajectories follow this course. This modern understanding of life after oil as being both productive, progressive, and necessarily the opposite of this sort of pre-oil ancien regime is perfectly highlighted in an interview given by a Saudi businessman to a French reporter for Le Monde around the time of abolition in early 1961. He decried, quote, the relegation of thousands of women behind household walls and the maintenance of thousands of people as in slavery. He said, all of this cuts off a good portion of the potential manpower which the country needs. For this ascendant new middle class then, at the dawn of the new austere era of King Faysal and the conservative modernity that it represented, slavery was merely a legacy of pre-modern, pre-oil society representing conspicuous consumption and not one of modern productivity. This narrative can be and is often rightly critiqued by people who focus on trading societies between the Same and the Levant, or Hessa and the Indian Ocean world, or Hijaz in Africa. A response to this critique might be that focusing on mercantile families or societies represents only a nominal and niche view of an elite segment of society. But what the nationalist narrative and the cosmopolitan critique both miss, however, is the perception and trajectories of enslaved people. Around the same time as this previous businessman's interview with Le Monde, another story of slavery was evoked for a different Saudi man's argument. In the spring of 1962, before the abolition of slavery in October of the same year, an enslaved man named Marzouk launched an appeal to his colleagues for funds to purchase his wife and children's freedom. Marzouk worked for the oil company, but like many enslaved men, his salary was owed to the man who owned him. In Marzouk's case, his slave holder lived in Riyadh, and Marzouk's wife and children were with him, where they were also enslaved. Marzouk had been freed by this owner, but the man requested thousands of riyals for the freedom of Marzouk's wife and children. Marzouk's story was taken up then by a Saudi dissident in exile named Nasser Said. Said sent a telegram. Also, Nasser Said had led these Aramco strikes of 1953, and he was living in Syria at the time. Said sent a symbolic telegram to King Saud after learning of Marzouk's story, and it was published by the Egyptian newspaper Al-Jumhuriyya. He ended his telegram saying, we ask that the farce of one human being selling another should cease because it is a disgrace which ridicules Saudi Arabia before the nations. Nasser Said and the Arab nationalists' involvement in the Gulf and Saudi in the time period, as well as histories of the strike at Aramco, are familiar to many historians of Saudi. What is less known, though, is the story of Marzouk and how his quest to free his wife and children from bondage was taken up, diffused, and forgotten. I've read, not verified though, that his wife and children were sold to another slave owner before the abolition months later. There are many slave statements in the British records from Bahrain that are similar to Marzouk's. 25 years before the story of Marzouk was taken up, a man named Bilal bin Rashid arrived to the British. She had also been working at the oil camps in the Eastern Province. Bilal was born in Sudanese Sawakin and kidnapped alongside his mother as a baby, trafficked to Jeddah, sold to a wealthy man in Mecca. And as an adolescent, he was sold again and taken to Al-Hassa. He married an enslaved woman named Mubaraka, and together they had 3 sons and 1 daughter. He had been a shepherd until 1937, when his master found him a job at the oil company in Khobar. While he had been able to keep his initial salaries to spend on himself, his master came to him eventually and demanded the salaries. When Bilal refused, the man beat Bilal and took the money. Bilal then quit, ran away to Bahrain, and was issued freedom paper. Like the enslaved men in the pearl diving industry before the Great Depression, the histories of enslaved men employed at oil company camps, whose earnings were taken by their masters, can help us move beyond this notion in the study of slavery in the Arabian Peninsula in general, or the Arab and Islamic world in general, that slavery was one of conspicuous consumption rather than a productive one. This notion that the possession of household slaves added to rulers' or elite status and made slavery more benign because, unlike the Americas, slaves were not used to produce, but rather as ornaments, is still widespread in the scholarship. Its origins in Orientalist scholarship also explain how it fails to take into account the labor and production of enslaved workers in a household, and particularly the labor and production of enslaved women, not only in the production of household labor, but in reproducing either more slaves or at times reproducing the slave master's family itself. Enslaved men were not the only people to abscond and seek freedom beyond the traditional methods of buying oneself out of slavery. In 1946, as the Second World War came to a close and the British agency was restaffed and began to once again hear statements, a woman named Maryam Mohammed arrived to guarantee her freedom. Originally from Mecca, she stated that she was born to an enslaved mother named Salha, but that her father had been the free brother of her mother's owner. But as they weren't married, or he did not legally own her either, Maryam was considered to be a slave and was sold to serve a resident of Jeddah, who in turn later sold her to a large household in Riyadh, where she worked for 4 years. Unlike, she said, by the wives of her new master in Riyadh, she was sold by a business associate, and that same man left her with his ex-wife when he got a divorce. So she decided that she existed in legal limbo and she didn't know who properly owned her. She took it upon herself to escape to Bahrain, where she had lived for 3 years with an old poor woman, whom she might have been taking care of an older woman in exchange for shelter. She had been in this situation for 3 years, I said, before she learned that she could have documented evidence of the freedom she attained for herself in Bahrain. Women like Maryam, her statement and her trajectory in the Arabian Peninsula are not usually included in work on Saudi history, including work that focuses on women. Even in her brief statement, as formulaic as it may have been written in the source, we learn of how enslaved women's lives might have been remembered or repeated or thought of retrospectively. Her mobility, the routes on which she was sold, and the places to where she chose to escape, and the actions she undertook can serve to challenge, but mostly to expand and widen, I think, our understanding of narratives of women's histories and the diverse positions they held in Saudi society. Moreover, statements of enslaved women like Maryam directly refute the entire Manichaean discourse of production versus conspicuous consumptions. Maryam's labor made the large households of early to mid-20th century Arabia before oil wells or electricity or foreign domestic workers possible. Finally, there is this religious apologist narrative of Saudi history, and insofar as this narrative would address the slavery and slave trade, it does so with an ahistorical trope not unlike the Orientalists. Somehow, Islamic slavery was benign vis-a-vis comparisons to slavery in North America, that it recognized rights of the enslaved or encouraged manumissions. I'm not going to argue or dispute what religious scripture prescribes, as that's not my area of expertise, but I can, as a historian, challenge the notion of how slavery was practiced in Muslim societies of Saudi in the early 20th century. Furthermore, I ask, what does it even mean to say that Islamic slavery was better or more kind? In saying this, I'm wondering, although I have an idea, who is being silenced or whose memories or legacies are no longer relevant to discuss or think about just because we accept blindly or scholars accept blindly and uncritically this statement or feel the need to justify this. Many of the slave statements indicate being born to free parents or free fathers and enslaved mothers. According to Islamic jurisprudence, then they could not be enslaved, and yet they were. Furthermore, many of the people arriving at the agency, which was only one way of being manumitted, were seeking to guarantee manumission they had already received from a local Muslim judge. These people too should jurisprudentially have been considered free because they were freed, and yet they worried and feared re-enslavement. And the historical record justifies that fear. When I first agreed months ago to give this presentation, both my own thinking and research were at very different places than today. 10 months ago, I had not yet to consult these British archives, and I assumed them to be too formulaic and reliant on British consular and diplomatic history to be of much use. This was partially due to my own naivete and my place in my research, but it was also largely informed by how these archives had been used up until now in the existing scholarly work. The India office records include entire functioning of the British agency in the Gulf, but unfortunately it's the inter-British or Anglo-Saudi negotiations that have been the focus on virtually all the work done with these sources. A couple of main exceptions that come to mind are a 2008 article by Professor Elaine Hudson entitled Enslavement and Manumission in Saudi, 1926 to 38, and a book by a Polish historian, Jerzy Zadanowski, speaking with their own voices, the stories of slaves in the Persian Gulf in the 20th century, and to a lesser extent his other book. For me, what distinguishes these books to mention them is that even from the small existing literature on slavery in the Gulf and Arabian Peninsula, is their focus on the narratives and perceptions and points of view of the enslaved people themselves. So while I initially conceived of today's talk as a critique of the over-reliance on a source I thought might be too full of British policies, having spent the past months and most of this year on these sources, I've become partial to the understanding that it is not the fault of the source or even a lack of material, but rather the failure of scholars to engage critically or conceive of the usefulness of these formulaic slave statements in the files. Many scholars are quick to fall for the trap of dismissing work on slavery in the West as irrelevant to its study in the Arab world. Unfortunately, this has caused many to ignore the evolution of methodological discussions and how to address and work with sources referring to and dealing with enslaved people. I would not have been able to read these sources critically had it not been for work by American historian Saidiya Hartman or critical geographer Catherine McKittrick. This lack, or even sometimes refusal to interact with and learn from methodological discussions on the study of slavery in areas beyond the Arab world is most evident in the conclusions and work that has been done using the same sources upon which I have relied for today's discussion. However, beyond these files, there exist other sources to be explored. Memories, of course, are not only state archives or manumission documents. For brevity's sake, I've just outlined 5 perspectives regarding the history of slavery in Saudi that I think with. One would be people who were enslaved themselves because abolition only came in 1962. 2, people descended from enslaved families. 3, people from an enslaved ancestor in an otherwise free family. 4 would be people descended from slave-owning families. Or 5, people who have no intimate or family memories or connection to slavery. I find these categories helpful in both thinking of how slavery is remembered and written about, or how it's not written about, how it's discussed or how it's not discussed. I also find it helpful to bear in mind in terms of contemporary consequences of undertaking research on the topic itself. In his book on the history of modern Saudi genealogy of Sandra soil, Nadav Samin describes an encounter in a small Hijazi town, École, in 2011. He describes the history of the town and how its sedentary population had been described in the previous 2 centuries by European and Arabs alike as Black Africans, or they used other terms of 19th century racial scientific discourse. Samin writes that the locals of the town had created a sedentary culture based on date cultivation, separate from the nomadic groups nearby. As the Saudi state emerged, and nomadic groups with enforceable claims to ownership over the town itself were settled there, Samin describes how the collective noun for the town, to refer to the townspeople, had come to be seen as a derogatory word. Why? An older man from the village said to Samin, "Don't use that word. The term is derogatory and means that the people of École have no lineage. It is better to represent oneself according to one's tribal origins." The term implies that the people descended from the sedentary population of École have no heritage because it indirectly references the view of nomadic elements, at least from the surrounding regions of the town, to ownership over both the town and the date palm plantations and the people of École itself, the non-nomadic population. This is not directly stated, but it's abundantly clear. Another conversation that Samin has with the doctor reveals who can remember the past of slavery, and it is not the people descended from the enslaved. In a discussion with a local doctor, descended from nomadic groups and not the townspeople, the doctor tells Simeon, the author, no, don't believe them. You should know that this notion of their belonging to the tribe is not correct. Perhaps Mawali, meaning slaves of the tribe. I know that the blacks of Al-Ula claim belonging to the tribe, but it isn't correct. Don't believe them. Khaybar is also black, and they claim to belong. This is a tough issue. Among the Arabs, you should know in the past, the dark-skinned, the Africans, were Mawali, slaves. They affiliated lineally with the tribe. They were called Muwallid, meaning a black person who was born in the tribe and lived with them, his father being a slave. This sort of directness and frankness of the topic might astound many scholars who have found it difficult to approach the topic of the history of slavery because of its sensitivity, or because they approach Saudis whom they presume to be descended from enslaved ancestors, yet who have no recollection, or at least are not willing to recollect it to foreign or unsympathetic scholars. How family history is remembered by people descended from enslaved ancestors in Saudi can vary greatly. Its absent presence, as Catherine McKittrick calls it, or the open secret to which Nadav Simeon refers in the above ethnography of Al-Ula, or the fact that it is openly not discussed, we can say, can be understood to attest to a desire of early generations of enslaved people in Saudi Arabia and the peninsula writ large to ease the hardship on their Arabian-born children and descendants. It can be understood, in fact, as a tool of survival. Emirati scholar and archivist Dr. Aisha Belkhair has suggested in her own work on the history of slavery in the Emirates and the Gulf that tribal ideology had the strongest impact on African slave communities. In an effort to assimilate, the enslaved appropriated tribal traditions which they contributed and passed on to their children. To encourage their children to integrate, African slaves advocated their participation in tribal activities rather than involving them in African-rooted expressions. Emerging scholars of slavery in Saudi Arabia and the Arabian Peninsula in general, especially those with no intimate experience with the topic, would be wise to bear this in mind. Thank you.
Yes, should I proceed?
The floor is yours, Mohammed.
Thank you so much. So clearly, I'm not the historian of this region, neither am I a historian of memory of slavery. What I do is much more trying to understand the ending of slavery in the long 19th century in North Africa by looking at Igor documents. But I was extremely delighted to read the paper by Faisal. I think it's innovative in many ways, and I shall ask a few questions, in fact, maybe to leave some time for the audience to ask questions to really a fascinating project. So first, and most of my comments will be in comparison with the history or the historiography of slavery in North Africa to open up a bit the debate in this sense. So what I found extremely interesting is your use of sources, what I would call ego documents, but you don't use this word, meaning all the questions that have been asked in the British consulates and how the slaves are answering to these questions, and how for you it's a way to revise the historiography of Saudi Arabia and how to challenge this historiography. And my first comparison would be with recent or current research on early modern Morocco. For instance, the work of Shukri El-Hamel with the book entitled Black Morocco, and the current doctoral project by Samir Razouki. So their projects are much more, and their research are much more to show how the monarchy was in fact a structure of domination who did racialize the population in Morocco, while in fact your questioning is much more about how debates about slavery were founding the state of Saudi Arabia. But interestingly, so this is not your take. You're not taking the same kind of approach than the historians of Morocco. But interestingly, Samir Razouki is much more using than Shukri El-Hamel the notion of racial capitalism, which has been extremely important. Even we had like a discussion on Friday about how to apply this notion to the history of the Middle East. So what do you make of this notion, knowing that in fact as well accumulation of capital became extremely important in the creation of Saudi Arabia? The second interesting part of your project is, I mean, it's not explicit now in the paper that I had to read, but for me, it's quite important, which is the notion of taboo and silence. Recently, there was a newspaper in France, which published a special issue about slavery in the Arab world, and it was extremely lazy, starting with the idea that it's a taboo, that there is a silence about that, when we know that it's much more complicated than that. In the sense that, for instance, in North Africa, you have novels about the slavery. I mean, it's indeed, as you said, and as Philippe said, it's sensitive. But there are novels and there are academic works in Arabic about that. So what's the use of the notion of taboo and silence in the West? How is it useful? I mean, to portray people as completely ignorant. So, I mean, we should as well assess and reassess this notion of silence. And you're doing it in a perfect way when you're speaking about openly not discussed. I think this is the nuance of this notion of taboo and silence. My third comment will be about, so in your presentation today and in the paper, you question and you challenge an approach of slavery in the Islamic world, which often sees the slavery in the Islamic world as a part of the household economy, and insisting on the fact that the slaves are well treated. And I was wondering, is it part of historiography that is developed in Saudi Arabia? Because in English, I guess that English or in French, this kind of approach has been questioned. And I think that interestingly, and for me, one of the most interesting paper to discuss household economies and as well Islam has a cultural hegemony is the paper by Fred Cooper about the ideology of slave owners on the East African coast. And I'm mentioning this indeed really known paper just as a way as well to open up beyond the case of Saudi Arabia, because you show some connections. You show connections with the Ottoman Empire, for instance, but how can you even go beyond this kind of national narrative about Saudi Arabia and the formation of the state? And as another connection, you discussed the history of these Armenian women in the context of the genocide. And I think it would be interesting to see other connections, which will be part of your challenge to discuss the silence and the absence, or the absence and the presence. Among my last comments, because it's really important to have other questions from the audience here, your sources. Basically, most of them are British sources, and you show that it's not an issue that they are British sources. It's much more how do we do read these sources. But still, I was wondering about other sources than this one. In my own work and in other works about North Africa, we use indeed colonial sources, which are extremely important, but we are trying to find other ways which are not completely colonial. And so, yeah, what are the alternatives? What are the other options that you can, I mean, it was a short paper, you could not discuss everything, but for the people attending this presentation, what kind of other source can you discuss? And among the sources, oral history, for instance. Last comment about your use of Saidiya Hartman's work. I was curious about how you read her, how you're using her work for your own interpretation of the British sources, because she's becoming indeed hugely influential outside of the field of US history. And my last point is about the 1962 abolition. Is it the end of your own story, and how, because I guess that people are asking you this kind of question about forced labor, human trafficking, and what do you make of that? Is it part of what you're trying to investigate, or is it completely outside of your analytical framework? Thank you so much.
Should I address Professor Wadi's comments and then look in these chat box, Philippe? Is that okay? Thank you so much, Professor Wadi. It's a lot, and I think you've caught on a lot to the nature of this presentation today, the gaps that I have in it, and I think a lot of it is related to how this relates to my greater doctoral research. This is.
No, I wouldn't say that these are gaps. So I think it's.
Oh no, thank you. No, but this is maybe the most, not to use the terms of margins and centers, but this is maybe one of the most marginal aspects of my own doctoral research. You know, I went to do a degree in modern European history, and I wanted to do something not on Saudi, but I couldn't help but see these connections. So today's presentation is, you know, a collection of my observations and things that are not per se relevant to my research, but that I think with, you know, based on my own, having worked before in Riyadh and in the research community there. So there's no specific reason as to why I chose to just focus on Saudi Arabia today, other than that's where I'm from. And this is a situation that I know, and I wanted to, it helped me shorten my presentation today. This, you know, the story of slavery in the Arabian Peninsula has been actually really worked on well lately, especially in the Gulf and what I as a Saudi would say is the Gulf, so the other Gulf states, connected to the Indian Ocean, and also the Hijaz, which is where my interests are as someone who's working on trans-Saharan slave trade in the mid-20th century. So why a Saudi? This is just, you know, a matter of how I decide to present today. The question of taboo is also really important to me, because I grew up myself in a family where we have some stories of who was enslaved from our grandparents and who was not, but it was, I said openly, not talked about, because that was the situation in which we grew up. This was something we knew and we didn't talk about, and we knew that we don't talk about it. So that kind of led me to, but I don't think it's wrong for Westerners to observe that it is a taboo or that it's sensitive, because I couldn't say that that's not true. But I think that there is more nuance, and that there is more nuance in why it's not talked about, how actively something is not remembered versus not recalled. I think there's a lot there. I don't, in my own work, envision doing oral histories or work on this, because like I said, the Saudi aspect is personal interest and not the center of my own research. But there's so much that could be done there. But as I kind of, I think, advise at the end of my presentation today, it would take a particularly astute and sympathetic and very nuanced type of researcher. I actually had a great conversation with Professor Mohammed one time about how do you address, if you're talking to communities that are considered by the greater community to be descendants of the enslaved, but they do not have this narrative. What do you do with that as a historian? How do you balance that? You cannot give people a history that is not their own history of how they remember things. I think that's something that people need to seriously think about. Why is it not openly talked about if it's openly acknowledged? And who is acknowledging it? You know, in the Nadab Samin books, I think for anyone who's talked about foreigners or Saudis themselves who've talked about this topic, I think it would benefit anyone who's had these conversations in Saudi to reflect on who was forthcoming and who was talking about this and what is their position to this story. And in my understanding and my own experiences, it would not be people who have such an intimate or recent connection to slavery themselves or their immediate relatives. Did I address?
I mean, absolutely.
Oh, racial capitalism. I don't feel equipped to. I like the discussion of conspicuous consumption and productivity. I know that it is been challenged a lot in specific work on slavery in the greater region. But mostly what I meant was when slaves or slavery are mentioned in general books about Saudi or other aspects about Saudi Arabia, there tends to be, I don't think that those people have read the books of Benjamin Marley or Matthew Hopper who are detailing the agriculture and the production, or Fred Cooper and East Africa. And I think that it would behoove more people to read beyond.
Yeah, and there is a question coming on from Abrar Shamari about the use of non-colonial sources, which was one of the questions that I raised.
Yeah, totally. Like I said, I envisioned when I was invited to do this talk to just give a whole presentation about why we should not use these British sources, because everyone uses them, and who cares about the negotiation between Hafiz al-Akhbar, the British, about suppression. But you can't ignore all these manumission documents. It's just such a rich source that has not been used critically, except for, Elaine Hudson. And that's not to say that you can't be quantitative and not critical, but Professor Hudson's article is a very quantitative article. And the Zdanowski book. There's just so much to do with just these sources. And like I said, Saudi is not actually the focus of my own research. But in my own research, of course, I would move beyond using non-colonial sources. You mentioned ego documents, you say? For whatever reason, these are more readily available in West Africa and the Sahara in Arabic than in Saudi or the Hijaz. I can't say that I've done extensive research on what is written in Arabic from this time period, because this is not, in Saudi at least, my focus. There are also novels from novelists today. There's a lot of work you could use. No one, as far as I know, has looked at newspapers or court rulings from the early era of the Saudi period. People have said that these don't exist, but I know that that's not true, because I used to work in Riyadh. I know I've seen and heard what Saudi PhD students or master's students use from Adara, use from local municipal archives. I don't know of many people who have used local municipal archives. They're definitely not organized. But like in Ilfat, you can find a lot of things. I've seen from working, in this research community in Saudi, what there is. And just seeing how present slavery is in newspapers or in these British sources and these discussions, there's no doubt in my mind that it's present there, but you need to be wanting to look for it. You can't, if you go in and you're interested in the history of this region or Saudi in general, you're going to look for what you're looking for. I think what helps me make these connections that I made, this Le Monde article, this was such an obscure book on African Catholicism and decolonizing Senegal that I traced, and I found it was a Saudi businessman who was talking about slavery the year before. But granted, that's what I'm looking for. So.
No, yeah, absolutely. And indeed, I let other people to ask questions, but so basically what you're saying is that there are novels written about the topic as well for the region. We see that in North Africa. There are academic work in Morocco and Algeria, Tunisia, but the problem always is that these works have not been published because of the economic situation of the academia, at least in North Africa. So I see that it's sensitive, and it's sensitive in many regions, but saying that North Africans are not studying the topics, are not writing about it. For me, it's usually problematic because it's another kind of Orientalism in a way.
I think it would also be problematic to say that no one is talking about this in Saudi or in the Gulf in general. Not, Qatar and UAE. I've seen more talked about it directly in terms of academic work, but there are novels, there are known stories, there are anecdotes, there are novels you can think about if you want to do this project on Saudi. I'm now questioning why I focused on, if it was more interesting to me to focus on Saudi, but less helpful for an audience in terms of a presentation, to have limited myself to Saudi today. But yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mohammed. Thank you, Faisal, for your talk. And I was really glad to hear both of you today connecting your fields of research. As mentioned by Mohammed, the big question is a question of scale, since in a way, speaking about slavery challenges the boundaries between or leads us to a history that is both beyond the national scale and I would say above the national scale, as you mentioned about the connection between tribal history and tribal lineages, and the integration of slaves or descendants of slaves into tribal lineages or into the national frame. And this is really challenging because, as you mentioned, today you reduce your frame, Faisal, to Saudi, but still, I mean, the huge work is to be done about the regional, or I don't know, other chronological, geographical scale to deal with this topic, which is in a way methodologically, I don't know how to say it, challenging. You just mentioned the novels. I see in the audience a good friend of mine in Kuwait who just advised me to read Farid Ramadan's novel Al-Muhit al-Inglizi, which in a way is a way of dealing with this history, a novel history, but a brilliant novel, Al-Muhit al-Inglizi. So I would like to ask you, I mean, could you just develop or say a bit more about your scale of frames of research? And in a way, do you build your argument on some novels? You just mentioned that it's not a topic that is not talked about. Actually, in Saudi Arabia, as far as I know, and even on my own research, everybody knows that slavery has a history, who is connected to slave, who was a slave dealer, who is a descendant of slave. I mean, but it's still a taboo. I mean, we don't speak openly about it, but everybody is actually speaking about it. I mean, it's a huge history. And as you said, I mean, it's part of Saudi history. So I would like just you to expand on it because for me, it's methodologically very interesting. And after we leave the floor to, because we have some question to ask. And a question which is related to mine is that do you see something which is specific to Saudi comparing to other Gulf states? For example, I'm thinking about the question of Erin Pettigrew related to the history of enslavement and nationhood when compared to the other countries in the Gulf. Thank you, Faisal, and thank you, Mohammed.
No, thank you. I'm sorry, Philippe. I was trying to think of a formulated response to you, but then I got completely distracted by Aaron's question. Did you, yeah, in terms of the novel, I suppose this is just really a side effect of me focusing on maybe something too marginal to my own work. But yeah, I don't see, in terms of what is talked about, what is openly not talked about, I do think that I have a hunch or a feeling that both, you know, this like turn to, there was a part I was going to mention more of Nadab Samin's book, this turn to genealogy in the later half of the 20th century, that is very well known to scholars of Saudi like yourself. Between that and, you know, the classic taboo to not ask people about their mothers, I think that this kind of culture about genealogy, maternal lineage, this in some instances helps these things not be talked about because in general we don't talk about intimate histories, we don't talk about maternal lineages, we don't talk about statuses of women in relationships prior to the abolition of slavery. Was, you know, this woman the wife of so and so? That's what we say. That's what we say in polite society. But, you know, we might all know it's a different case if we're talking about a specific relative. This helps in some ways the stigma not be talked about publicly, but it also encourages the not talking about it in a way that is not very productive. Because like you said, this is very openly not discussed. If people are telling you as a researcher, these people are slaves and we are this or that, that's not even openly not discussed. It's open discussion. It's a matter of, I don't know if it would be the right use, it's a politics of respectability. A lot is hidden behind what we don't talk about. And I probably used to think, and many people might think, that this is helpful to people who might be stigmatized, but I also see it as very harmful because it does not allow the discussion to be had. I don't know if that was addressing all of your points, but that's addressing one point that I remember. And then in terms of slavery, and I don't think so. I think that the thing that's most different to me would be the roots. And a lot of people have worked on the East African or Indian Ocean slave trade that goes through Kuwait and the Gulf states. And one of the things that led me to include the Arabian Peninsula in my work is not only that I am Hijazi and from Jeddah, but that in my own work in the Sahara of this time period, it's a trans-Saharan slave trade that arrives to Jeddah and Mecca through the area that I work on. That is not so much the case from what I've understood of the Gulf states. And just for Dr. Fahed's comment, I totally agree. If I was working on Saudi and doing this, I would totally be using petitions to like local rulers' courts to Fatawi. And I do that in my own work in the Sahara at the time period. But again, that's more readily available. Somehow, you know, people, anthropologists, ethnographers have collected and combined these Arabic sources in the Sahara. They're at universities, you can go there on the ground, whereas the grunt of the field work to find these things or to bring them together is still to be done for Saudi.
And if I may, Faisal, could you answer the second question by Fahd Bishara? I don't know if he's still with us, about the fatwa literature. I mean, do you have some legal or fatwa literature about slavery, or is it interesting? Does it bring something new, or?
I'm always at this is always such a tough question, and it's always my biggest actual gap is religion. I feel in general that focuses on religion or on religious history or on religious documents is, you know, what everyone wants to do with related to Saudi Arabia. So it might be more of like a political or methodological commitment that I focus less. But especially I realize as I work on, or I want to look at manumissions and these type of things that went through, you know, Islamic courts and went through these things, I cannot ignore it. So like, again, if I was working on this full time, I would begrudgingly, but knowing that I have to, yes, look at these sources. But I do believe that less religiously dependent histories are able to be written about Saudi.
Well, thank you so much, Faisal. I don't know if we still have some question because the time is running out. I mean, we want to stick to the hour standard, and it's close to 1 hour. So I think we've done it. We've gone through the questions. Okay. Thank you very much.
Maybe last question. So Faisal, will you publish this paper or not?
I imagine many of the stories in this paper are forming a chapter of my dissertation. There's a bigger story that was not related to slavery, but was more related to decolonial politics in France, and this actually weird moment where everyone's talking about slavery in Saudi to compare to how can Saudi defend or call on Algerian independence or Tunisian independence in the UN and they still have slavery. And so there's suddenly a lot of newspaper articles and exposés in Mecca and Jeddah about the trans-Saharan slave trade that I'm interested on. So I do see a lot of this being at least one chapter, if not a bigger story. But actually the bulk of what I did today, which is this like critical reading of the British documents, no, because what I want to do is see the French versions of these documents that I have only heard exist but have not seen yet. But I'm moving to Paris in January to find them.
Yeah, it makes me think about what Jeff Eden has made about the Central Asian trade, you know, of slavery, and his article Beyond the Bazaars. He's actually relying on the same or similar British colonial archives as you did, trying to read it on another way or an innovative way to show how the Russian did not put an end, as it was claimed, to slavery, and how the network, it's quite a different approach from you, but the network was a kind of network that was beyond the bazaar in the steppe, and a kind of decentralized network of trade. So yes, I think it's really both as a topic and as a method, challenging and a novel subject. So thank you for sharing your thoughts and experiments and reflection and answering our questions today. Thank you very much, Mohammed, for giving us your knowledge about the topic and bringing us much further than the Arabian Peninsula and the Gulf into the wide world, which in a way is the world of slavery and the history of slavery. Before concluding this session, I would like just to say you that next week we'll have another lecture, totally different subject, by Awad Al-Hasiri, an archaeologist from Najran, who will speak about Najran and the recent excavation discoveries in Najran. And the lecture will be moderated by our distinguished colleague from the Sefer in Muscat, Munir Albash. So please stay tuned, as they say in Britain. I've just posted the poster for this lecture. And once again, thank you, Faisal, and thank you, Mohammed. Hopefully, we'll bring you for a second opportunity in a few years or in a year to see how far you got. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Philippe. Thank you, Professor Wade. Thank you, everyone, for coming.